Good morning. It is certainly wonderful to see you here this morning. Except I'm very happy and glad that you have chosen to be here. You know, we often talk about there are several things that make a day great, and no doubt today we can certainly find many of those things that would make a day great, but none greater than the fact that it is the Lord's Day and that we can be assembled here, those of like precious faith, as we have been given this opportunity to worship God in spirit and in truth. And I'm appreciative of you and your willingness and your choice to be here. If you have your Bibles, and I pray that you do, be turning with me over to the book of 1 Timothy chapter 4. 1 Timothy chapter 4, we're going to specifically look this morning at verses 7 through 9. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 through 9. The last couple of Sundays, at least here on Sunday mornings, we've been looking at a series of lessons entitled A Faithful Saying. A Faithful Saying. And several times throughout the book of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, Paul would use this expression, a faithful saying. And as we have made mention in both the previous lessons, Paul uses this terminology to draw one's mind, to draw one's attention to what is about to be said. Well, in this case, he actually uses it in the opposite. In other words, he uses it to draw attention to what has just been said. And so in the two previous statements, he says, pay attention to what I'm getting ready to say. And this morning he's saying, pay attention to what I have just got done saying. And so he again is wanting to draw our attention to this statement that he's going to make. And look there in 1 Timothy chapter 4, starting there in verse number 7. He says, but refuse profane and old wives' fables, and exercise thyself rather unto godliness. For bodily exercise profiteth little, but godliness is profitable unto all things, having the promise of life that now is, and of that which is to come. This is a faithful saying, and worthy of all acceptation. And so Paul is saying, listen, there is something that I want you to pay attention to. There is something that you need to take note of. Now, the overall thing that Paul is really going to be pressing in these verses is the idea of godliness. You know, sometimes when we define words, we can really use the word within a word to really help us define it. For example of that, when we define righteousness, we will sometimes simply define the word righteousness as doing what is right. I often add to that definition by saying doing what is right according to the standard of God, because it is the case that sometimes, and most of the time, that man's standard on what is right and God's standard on what is right is two completely different things. And so when we think about godliness doing that which God would have you to do, having characteristics, having traits in your life that profess godliness. I believe Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 5, there in verse number 16, but let your light so shine among men that they may see your good works and glorify the Father. Paul would say in Galatians chapter 2 and verse number 20, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I who live, but Christ who liveth in me. He would go on to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse number 1, be ye imitators or followers of me, as I also imitate Christ. So what is Paul saying? The things that you do in your life need to reflect Jesus. Jesus would say the things that you do in your life, they need to reflect God. In other words, as we strive to live this Christian life, we should strive to live a life full, if you will, of godliness. And sometimes doing things that are godly, having godliness attitudes, are just what we might consider simple things. What we might consider easy things. The first thing, though, that we need to discuss is something that Paul makes mention there in verse number 7. Verse number 7, he says, refuse profane and old wives' fables. And that's what we want to look at, refusing something. You know, when you talk about exercising, when you talk about dieting, and I know I'm probably the last person that you would ever want to take those type of advice from, but you know, some things you have to change, right? You realize, okay, I'm not living maybe a healthy life, maybe I'm not eating the way that I should be eating, maybe I'm not drinking things that I should be drinking, and so I'm going to start an exercise routine. But what they will tell you is, yes, starting an exercise routine is good, but before that exercise will ever do you any good, there are certain things you have to get rid of. There are certain things that you have to remove. And that's what Paul is going to do. He's going to start this illustration on exercise, but before he ever gets to exercise, he says, listen, if you want the exercise to work, there are things that you have to refuse. There are things that you have to get rid of. And he says the idea of refusing or rejecting that which is profane. Those old wives' fables. Now the idea there of those things that are profane, those things that we should reject, is just simply those things that are unholy. We should reject those things that are unholy. When one considers God, right? Because he's going to make a statement here in a minute that we need to exercise unto godliness. We need to strive to be godly. And so when you consider God, when you consider the attributes of God, when you consider the characteristics of God, and you think about what Paul's saying, that you need to refuse, you need to reject that which is profane, that which is unholy. Well, is not God holiness? Is not God light? And does He not shun? Does He not reject those things which are against Him? In 1 John chapter 1 and verse number 5, we read that God is light, and in Him is notice that, no darkness at all. And so if you were to put God in a dark room, guess what? It would no longer be dark. Because God gets rid of darkness. God has nothing to do with darkness. And I know we've used this illustration before, but man, it's a great example. When Adam and Eve sinned, what did God do? He drove them from the Garden of Eden. You go look at that word that's used there in Genesis chapter 3. It's the idea of driving cattle. You get out of my presence because you have sinned, because you have sin in your life. I will have nothing to do with you. That's what the prophet would illustrate there in Isaiah chapter 59, verses 1 and 2, that says, your sins, your iniquities have separated you from God. It has nothing to do with God's ability, the fact that He can't hear your prayer. It has nothing to do with God's ability that He can't reach out and help you. But it has to do because there is sin between you and God. He won't. When you think about that from God, God shuns, God rejects darkness. But you know what? We think about that characteristic. Look over at John chapter 3. Because I think we understand, and rightfully so, that God is light, and He does reject those things. But notice what darkness does to light. John chapter 3 and verse number 20, for everyone that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. Notice that those that dwell in darkness, those that enjoy darkness, what do? They hate the light, and you might even say they run from the light. They want nothing to do with it. And so Paul, as he's opening this particular statement to that young evangelist Timothy, as you're living your life, you got to understand, Timothy, there are things that you have to do, and you have to refuse, you have to reject those things that are unholy. You have to get those things that are... Let's just be honest, those things that are sinful. And you have to remove them from your life. Don't allow them into your life. Don't allow them into your home. Don't allow them into your car as you're listening to the radio. You know, it's rather quite surprising. Well, maybe it's not surprising when you turn on the radio and you listen to a song and it seems like every other song is about drinking this and drinking that. You can't stay on a station too long before you have to turn it off. But then you think about that's bad, and you turn on the TV, and what? It's even worse, is it not? Now, I'm not saying that it's a sin to listen to the radio. I'm not saying that it's a sin to watch your TV, because if you get in my car, guess what? There's going to be a radio that's on. You come to my house, guess what? There's a TV there. I'm not saying it's sinful to have those things. But what Paul is saying is you need to reject those things that are evil. So when that song comes on the radio, turn it off. When that TV show comes on the TV, shut it off. When the football team of your hometown wins a national championship and they're running through the streets drunker than a skunk, turn it off. Should not allow those things into our home, because God is light and He shuns darkness. And if we are going to have godliness in our life, then we too should shun darkness. But He didn't just say to shun those profane things. He also goes on to say, get rid of those old wise fables, those things which are false. The idea there of wise fables is literally that which is false and is impossible to happen. So Paul says all those things that you hear out there that are impossible, that are never going to happen, get rid of those things. Really, when you think about God, with God, all things are possible, right? Now, we understand those are those things that line in with godliness. But you think about these old wise fables and how they are falsehoods, how they are lies. Paul is saying reject those things, but rather you should turn to truth, right? We understand that God is truth. The very words that He speaks is truth. John chapter 17 and verse number 17. But I find it interesting. Paul says reject those things which are false. Reject those things that are impossible, those things that never can happen. But you think about God, He's the exact opposite of all of those things. Not only is He truth, not only is He possible, we know He exists. Romans chapter 1 and verse number 20. You can go out and you can look at creation and you can know because of that there is a God. Isn't it wonderful to know that there is a God? But even beyond that, isn't it wonderful to know that our God left us His will so we can know what it is that we need to do in order to be saved? Paul says, reject those things. You might put it this way. Instead of saying reject those things which are profane, rejecting those things which are false, you could have just said it this way. Reject those things that are not godly. Because it would very well fit with what he would go on to say. If you go back there to 1 Timothy chapter number 4, there within verse number 7, what's the very next thing that he says after he says to reject or to refuse those things? He says, and so there's your conjunctions. You need to be refusing this thing, and at the same time exercise thyself unto godliness. So be rejecting these things. We talked about that. You're going to get physically healthy, right? You got to reject those things that are bad. No longer can have cake and all those wonderful things. You're going to have to start eating some broccoli, and I know that sounds terrible, but you're going to have to start eating some broccoli and some spinach and some of those other green things. But at the same time, you're rejecting that which is wrong. And so here Paul is saying, listen, reject that which is wrong, but exercise unto godliness. The idea of exercise, as he says, just as an athlete would train themselves to get into shape, so must a Christian train themselves to be godly. Most people, they don't just get up off the couch today and tomorrow go running a marathon. So it takes training. It takes exercise. An individual isn't going to become a Christian today and tomorrow be 100% godly. It doesn't work that way. It takes training. It takes effort on our part. The word exercise here literally comes from the background of what the Greeks would do. The Greeks, they were very into the physical body. so much so that they would build gymnasiums in just about every city so individuals could go to these gymnasiums and work on their physical body. But Paul is not concerned about the physical body because he says, exercise thyself unto godliness. Exercise thyself with reverence to God. Exercise thyself in respect to the Word of God. Exercise thyself in characteristics of God. Now I understand there are some, what we would, I guess, call rather attributes and characteristics that you and I will never attain. You and I will never be able to obtain all-knowing, which is not going to happen. I mean, you are never going to be able to obtain all-powerful. It's not going to happen. But there are attributes of God that are certainly obtainable, and those are the things that we need to be working towards. Along those same lines, in verse number 8, he makes the statement, "For godly exercise profiteth little." Now, this is not to say that bodily exercise is worthless, but it's the point that Paul is making. Now you think about the culture that we just said, the Greeks, they were concerned about the physical physique of the body. They wanted the physical physique to just be outstanding. It was important to them. And so Paul is playing on that. He says, the physical exercise, the bodily exercise, it profiteth little. And again, it's not to say that that's not important, but when you compare it to godliness, it's nothing. That's Paul's point. He's saying, listen, you know these people, and if you're one of these people, I don't have anything against you. Don't misunderstand me. But you ever know someone, they live in the gym, call them a gym rat? Like every time you go to a gym, they're there, they're lifting the weights, and they're running on the treadmill faster than what's humanly possible. If I ever tried to run that fast on a treadmill, I'd be on my nose. But that's what they do. Paul's saying the effort that you're putting into that bodily exercise, is it equivalent or even more so to the exercise that you're putting into godliness? To the exercise that you put into your biblical things? We talk about the verses, and we don't have to hash through all of these. We don't necessarily have to turn over. But you remember what Paul what Luke would write about the Bereans, right? These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, and the fact that they searched the Scriptures, how long? Or how often, rather? Daily. We know those people that they go to the gym daily. If you're going to the gym daily, do you open your Bible daily? Paul would tell Timothy, study to show thyself to prove a workman needeth not to be ashamed, handling aright the word of truth. Are you in the Bible as much as you are in the gym? There's nothing wrong with being in the gym. But are we in our Bibles? Even though bodily exercise profits the physical man, it certainly does not make one more spiritual. And that's the point that Paul is making. But he goes on to say, but, notice the contrast there, but godliness is profitable unto all things. All things. Having the promise of life that now is and of that which is to come. And so Paul says, listen, if you want to do physical exercise, that's great, but make sure you're doing the spiritual exercise. Make sure you're doing the godly exercise, because that is the thing that is most important. Notice he said godliness is profitable to all things. The word profitable there in its original origin literally meant to help. And so, in other words, godly exercise is helpful in all avenues of life. Peter would say we have all things that pertain unto life and godliness. God has given us everything that we need to be a godly person. And when we are practicing godliness, it helps us be that type of person. There's tons of these that we could go on. I just put 3 down. Does not godliness help us to be holy? Go over to 1 Peter chapter number 1. And notice what Paul would write here in 1 Peter chapter 1. And we're going to start in verse number 13. 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse number 13. Wherefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ, as obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lust in your ignorance, but as He which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, because it is written, Be ye holy, for I am holy. Do you notice how Peter starts that particular phrase? Gird up the loins of your mind. And this really fits right into the illustration that Paul is using back in 1 Timothy. So in that day and time, they had this long flowing garment that they would wear. And any time that you would have to go to work or you'd have to even go exercise, what they would do, they'd take these long flowing garments and they'd pull them up to about their knee level and they'd gird it together. And so it was really bringing their outfit into subjection so they could do what they had to do. And so that's the illustration that Peter is using. But notice what he says. Not gird up your physical loins, not gird up your garment, but gird up the loins of your mind. Make your mind ready to do that which is right. And he says, be sober. The idea of being sober there is having a clear mind, not having it clouded with anything else. So be sober. Gird up the loins of your mind for what is about to be done. In verse number 14 he says, do it as obedient children, not as your fathers did. Not as your former lust did. He said, you need to be holy. In other words, Peter is saying this. You want to be holy? This is what holiness takes. Work. If you want to be holy, it takes work. You're not just going to wake up tomorrow and say, oh, look at me, I'm holy. No, holiness takes work. It takes a mindset that, listen, I'm going to strive to live today to be a holy individual. And here's the thing. If I am exercising godliness, I'm exercising unto those godly traits, it helps me be holy because just as God is holy, I should be holy. And so if I see the things that God has and I'm putting them in my life, then it helps me not only to be a more godly individual, but a holy individual. Doesn't godliness also help us to have the proper respect for God? Look over at the book of Ecclesiastes, a passage that I know you're familiar with. There, Solomon being the writer of this particular book, and Solomon says, listen, I want to know what the point of man is. I want to know why we're here upon this earth. And so Solomon says, listen, I'm going to try it all. I'm going to build big vineyards. I'm going to build big barns. I'm going to build big houses. I'm going to try every type of industry. Solomon even tried with multiple women to try and make sense of this life. And after Solomon, he goes to this book and he's explained that he did all of these things. And notice what he comes to the conclusion. In verse number 13 of Ecclesiastes chapter 12, Solomon says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Why are we here, Solomon? To fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole of man. The whole of man. The purpose of man is to fear God, respect God for who He is, and to keep His commandments. You know, when you start considering who God is, man, that's a big study, right? There are several things that we could look at in the Bible, and obviously we don't have time this morning to look at who God is, because, man, that is a huge study. But when I start to understand just the basic of who God is, that He not only is He the creator of life, but He's the sustainer of life. He keeps this world going. You know, you do some interesting studies. You go back, the Discovery magazine that's back there on the table is about space. We've got some interesting information about space in there on the magazine, and it's talking about the position of the Earth as in relation to the sun. And I don't remember the exact percentage or whatever the thing that they use in there, but it's not very much. 1/4 of an inch, probably less than that. I think Sarah's saying a 20th up here. 20th, 60th. It's very, very small. But if the earth was just a 20th of an inch. Now, you think about a 20th of an inch. That's not very big. But if the earth was just a 20th of an inch closer to the sun, you know what would happen? We'd burn up. The earth would not be suitable for life. If the earth was just a 20th of an inch further from the sun, you know what would happen? We'd freeze. The earth would not be sustainable for life. That's how I know, no matter how many billions and billions of dollars that they spend, that they'll never find life on Mars. Because God did not design Mars for human life. And also, if there was human life on Mars, the Great Commission would be more than go ye into all the world. It would have to be go ye into outer space, because God cares about all souls and men. So don't worry about what NASA's telling you about Mars, because it's not true as far as there being life there. But there is life here because God designed it that way. And so when I start to understand who God is, I can start to have a better respect for Him and all that He's done for me and all that He's done for you. But doesn't godliness help us not only have a better respect for God, but doesn't godliness help us respect our fellow man? Paul would write in Galatians chapter 6 and verse number 10, "Therefore, as you have opportunity, do good unto all men, especially the household of faith." But I also think about something Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 5. Notice the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, starting there in verse number 44. Jesus there speaking, He says, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For He maketh His sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sendeth His rain on the just and the unjust. For if we love them which love you, what reward have we? Do not even the publicans the same?" Do you see what Jesus is saying? When we start exercising unto godliness, when we start exercising and having these godly traits in our eyes, then I start seeing man for man. If people were godly the way that they should be, what would not exist in this world? Racism, prejudice, those type of things would not exist. Now, don't misunderstand me, because some people try to throw racism into the same category with accepting people that are homosexual. It's not the same thing. Now, I don't hate the person that is involved in homosexuality. I hate the sin that they're involved in, and I pray for them to come out of it. But understand, it's not the same thing of an individual that has a different skin color. It's two different things. And do not let the media tell you that it's the same thing, because it is not. It's not the same thing. But when someone is godliness, those type of things, they don't matter, because they're all striving to do what God would have them to do. One last point here as we close. Go back to 1 Timothy chapter 4, because this is what Paul's talking about. 1 Timothy chapter 4. You put all this together there at the end of verse number 8. When he talks about, verse number 7, "Refuse those things which are profane, exercise rather unto godliness, bodily exercise profiteth little, but godliness is profitable unto all things." Now notice this, "having the promise of life that now is, and of that which is to come." This is a faithful saying, worthy of all expectation. So, the idea of the promise of the things to come and the thing that now is, this is the result of following godliness. The Christian knows, the true Christian knows, that a godly life is the very best life that can be lived. But besides that, it's the only way, now note this, the only way to have life after. So you got to live a godly life here upon this earth. And if you're living a godly life upon this earth, it's a great life. But Paul says it's the only way to obtain the next life. Let me tell you this. There will be, note this, there will be no ungodly people in heaven. None. Bertie likes that idea. No ungodly people in heaven. That's right. No ungodly people in heaven. Can't say it any better than that. So in closing, I want to ask you this. What are you exercising towards? Is it godliness, or is it just the things of this earth? I want to leave you with one passage as we close. Something that Jesus would say in the Sermon on the Mount, actually in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, in the Beatitudes, there in Matthew chapter 5, in verse number 6. And note the words of Jesus. He says, "Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." And you're probably thinking, well, Zach, what does that verse have to do with anything that we have talked about today? Because I want to leave you with an illustration. This entire time, Paul has been talking about exercising unto godliness. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says those who are hungering and thirsting after righteousness, they're going to be filled. It's the idea of feeding and exercising your spiritual body. Now, if you'll think physically with me for just a moment. When you go out and you see someone on the street, you can tell rather quickly if that person has been eating. You can tell rather quickly if that person has been in a gym working out. The results of what we eat, the results of working out, they're shown on our physical body. You can tell. I want to ask you this morning, if you had an opportunity this morning to look into a spiritual mirror, if God would allow you this morning to physically see your spiritual body with your eyes, would you be concerned? Would you say, man, I'm not eating enough spiritual food? Would you say, I am not exercising towards godliness enough? Now here's the thing. It's not a physical mirror. But we have been given the perfect law of liberty, as James would say, chapter 1. And we have the opportunity to gaze and continue therein. And if we do that, we will have a healthy spiritual body. We want to make sure that we offer the invitation to you this morning. So if you're here and you need the prayers of the church, come forward, let that be known. If you're here this morning, you're a child of God, but you have not been living that way, you have not been exercising unto godliness, change that this morning. Get to the spiritual gym, as they might say. I don't know. Never heard it before, but get to the spiritual gym. Get your workout on. Get in this book. You can come home, you can repent of whatever sin that you have, you can confess that to the Father, and He will forgive you of those sins. Maybe you're here this morning, you've yet to become a child of God. Why don't you do that this morning? Why don't you put Christ on in baptism? You're here, you know what you need to do, the only question is, why are you waiting? If there's anyone here that needs to respond to the Lord's invitation, I encourage you to come. Together we stand and we sing.